Welcome back to our channel for another deep dive into the dramatic world of Genoa City. Today is a beautiful day to explore the intense psychological warfare unfolding behind the closed doors of the Newman estate, where deeply buried secrets never stay hidden for long, and the consequences are always catastrophic. Let us unravel the latest explosive developments together. The heavy mahogany doors of Victor Newman's executive office slammed shut, the definitive click of the lock echoing like a death knell through the suffocating silence of the room. Inside this fortress of corporate power, the atmosphere was thick with an almost palpable dread, a toxic tension that had been steadily building ever since Billy Abbott's reckless and paranoid actions set a catastrophic chain of events into motion. Billy, driven by his own descent into madness and an obsessive need to destroy his rivals, had maliciously leaked a series of highly classified, secret financial transactions tied directly to Adam Newman. This calculated act of corporate sabotage had instantly drawn the relentless scrutiny of federal investigators, casting a dark, unforgiving shadow over the pristine legacy of Newman Enterprises. Victor, a patriarch who demanded absolute loyalty and operated with an iron fist, now stood in the center of the room like a predator cornering its prey, his cold, piercing gaze locked onto Adam. The patriarch viewed this leak not merely as a corporate vulnerability, but as a profound personal betrayal, a catastrophic failure on Adam's part that threatened to dismantle the empire Victor had spent a lifetime building with his bare hands. Under the crushing weight of Victor's lethal interrogation, Adam found himself utterly isolated, trapped in a psychological nightmare from which there was no escape. The pressure was mounting exponentially, exacerbated by the relentless demands for answers from Victoria Newman, who viewed this crisis as the ultimate proof of Adam's inherent untrustworthiness. Adam desperately attempted to explain the labyrinthine financial maneuvers, frantically trying to articulate the strategic necessity of his actions, but his defense was entirely hollow. He lacked the concrete evidence required to exonerate himself, leaving his words to hang in the air as empty excuses in the face of Victor's mounting fury. The historical weight of always being the family scapegoat, the eternal black sheep who could never quite earn his father's unconditional trust, crashed down upon Adam with devastating force. He was suffocating under the realization that, once again, he was standing before the almighty Victor Newman, accused of treason, entirely powerless to prove his innocence or protect the fragile position he had fought so agonizingly hard to secure within the family hierarchy. Just beyond the heavy wooden doors, Nikki Newman was fighting a desperate, silent war of her own, her fragile psychological state pushed to the absolute brink of collapse. Having recently navigated the terrifying darkness of her vision loss and the exhausting facade of feigning continued blindness to secretly investigate her husband, Nikki was already carrying an unbearable emotional load. As she listened to the muffled, aggressive tones of Victor's interrogation bleeding through the walls, a profound and sickening guilt washed over her. She recognized that the intense scrutiny falling upon Adam, the corporate investigation threatening the company, and the violent fracturing of her family were all symptoms of a much deeper, far more dangerous infection that she alone had been harboring. The agonizing realization crystallized in her mind that the immense, dark secret she had fiercely protected for decades was the true catalyst for this current apocalypse, and her continued silence was no longer shielding her family, but actively destroying it from the inside out. Driven by a sudden, primal surge of desperation, Nikki shattered the sanctity of the locked office, bursting through the doors with a frantic energy that instantly paralyzed the room. The physical and emotional dynamic of the space shifted violently as Victor and Adam turned to face her, their corporate warfare momentarily suspended by the sheer terror radiating from the Newman matriarch. Nikki stood before them, physically trembling, her breath catching in her throat as she prepared to detonate a truth that would irrevocably annihilate the foundation of their lives. She knew, with absolute certainty, that the words she was about to speak would not only alter the trajectory of Newman Enterprises, but would permanently destroy the complex, fragile bonds of trust and love that held their family together. It was a moment of ultimate sacrifice, a desperate leap into the abyss, driven by the horrifying understanding that the truth, no matter how devastating, was the only remaining weapon against total annihilation. With tears streaming down her face and her voice breaking under the weight of decades of deceit, Nikki delivered her first shattering confession, admitting to a crime that struck at the very heart of Victor's empire. She revealed, in agonizing detail, that she had been the one deliberately and systematically manipulating a series of highly classified funds within Newman Enterprises over the course of several years. The revelation hung in the air like a physical blow, the sheer audacity of her actions leaving Victor entirely speechless. The man who prided himself on absolute control, who believed he knew every single transaction that moved through his accounts, was forced to confront the impossible reality that his own wife, the woman with whom he had just celebrated a deeply emotional marital reconciliation, had been orchestrating a massive financial deception right under his nose. The betrayal cut deeper than any corporate espionage, striking at the core of Victor's profound vulnerability and his unwavering belief in Nikki's absolute loyalty. However, Nikki frantically pushed forward, desperate to contextualize her treason before Victor's shock could curdle into his signature, lethal rage. She vehemently explained that this elaborate financial manipulation was never born out of greed, malice, or a desire for personal enrichment, but rather out of a terrifying, desperate necessity. Nikki painted a harrowing picture of a shadow war she had been fighting entirely alone, a clandestine operation designed to neutralize a severe, existential external threat that Victor knew absolutely nothing about. She described the profound psychological isolation of carrying this burden, the sleepless nights spent moving funds and covering tracks, all driven by a singular, obsessive need to protect her husband's legacy and her family's safety from an adversary who operated in the darkest corners of their reality. Nikki had convinced herself that by keeping Victor in the dark, she was shielding him from a vulnerability that could have destroyed him, completely unaware that her unilateral actions were slowly poisoning the very foundation of their marriage. The true horror of Nikki's confession materialized when she finally gave a name to the phantom menace that had forced her hand, Matt Clark. The mere mention of his name sent a visible shudder through the room, as the insidious nature of Matt's plot to destroy the Newman family from within was laid bare. Nikki revealed that Matt, a man driven by a dark, unyielding history of trauma and vengeance, had been quietly pulling strings, utilizing extortion, psychological manipulation, and financial terrorism to slowly suffocate the Newman empire. His continued presence in Genoa City was not a mere coincidence, but a calculated, escalating siege, and Nikki's desperate diversion of funds was her misguided attempt to pay him off, to build a financial fortress, or to somehow outmaneuver a monster who thrived on their destruction. The revelation that Matt Clark was the architect of this hidden war exposed the terrifying reality that the Newmans were entirely vulnerable, their defenses breached by a man who held a catastrophic power over their matriarch. Yet, the financial embezzlement and the looming threat of Matt Clark were merely the prelude to the true apocalypse Nikki was about to unleash upon her husband and son. Pushed beyond the limits of human endurance, her spirit fractured by the weight of her own sins, Nikki looked directly into Victor's eyes and delivered the ultimate, soul-crushing truth. Adam was not his biological son. The declaration shattered the very fabric of reality within the office, a biological bombshell that annihilated decades of history, identity, and familial structure in a single, devastating heartbeat. Nikki confessed that this secret, a profound biological betrayal, had been buried deep within the darkest recesses of her past, a desperate lie maintained for decades to protect the fragile illusion of the Newman family structure and to shield Victor from a truth that she knew would destroy his pride and his soul. The psychological collapse of Victor Newman was a terrifying, silent spectacle, a monumental implosion of a man who believed his bloodline was his greatest, most untouchable achievement. As the reality of Nikki's words penetrated his consciousness, the corporate fury that had previously consumed him instantly evaporated, replaced by a profound, paralyzing heartbreak and a sense of betrayal so deep it defied human comprehension. The patriarch realized, with a sickening clarity, that his entire relationship with Adam, the decades of bitter rivalry, the agonizing attempts at reconciliation, the complex, toxic dance of a father and his namesake, was built upon a foundational, catastrophic lie. Worse still was the horrifying implication that Nikki, his beloved wife, had shared a child with an enemy, cementing the ultimate treason. Victor's worldview, constructed entirely on the pillars of loyalty, blood, and legacy, crumbled into dust, leaving him adrift in a sea of unimaginable pain and blinding cold fury. Simultaneously, Adam was thrust into a violent, existential crisis. his entire identity dissolving in the span of a few agonizing seconds. The realization that he did not possess the sacred Newman blood, that the lifelong, soul-crushing struggle for Victor's elusive approval was entirely meaningless, struck him with the force of a physical trauma. He was not the rebellious heir, he was not the dark reflection of his father, he was a biological outsider, a pawn in a massive, decades-long cover-up orchestrated by the woman standing before him. As the initial wave of shock began to subside, it was rapidly replaced by a dark, creeping suspicion regarding Nikki's true motives. Adam's sharp, analytical mind, honed by years of survival in the Newman family, began to question why Nikki chose this exact moment of corporate crisis and external threat to reveal a secret that could have remained buried forever, wondering if he was simply being sacrificed to distract from her own financial crimes. The immediate fallout of these twin confessions left the Newman family entirely fractured, their internal bonds severed beyond any hope of immediate repair. They were now trapped in a terrifying paradox, facing a catastrophic dual threat that demanded impossible choices. On one front, they were bleeding out from the internal destruction of their trust, their familial foundation completely annihilated by Nikki's lies and the revelation of Adam's true parentage. On the other front, they faced the external, rapidly escalating danger posed by Matt Clark, a ruthless adversary who would undoubtedly exploit this unprecedented vulnerability to enact his final, destructive revenge. The family was fundamentally broken, divided by betrayal and suspicion, yet they were forced to occupy the same battlefield, knowing that if they could not find a way to stand together, Matt Clark would inevitably slaughter them all. The road ahead for Victor and Nikki seemed entirely impassable, an agonizing landscape of shattered vows and unforgivable transgressions. They were faced with the impossible task of somehow repairing a trust that had been not just broken, but entirely eradicated at a molecular level. Victor, consumed by the ultimate betrayal, had to reconcile his profound love for his wife with the reality that she had lied to him about the most fundamental aspect of their family for decades. Nikki, drowning in guilt and the desperate hope for redemption, had to find a way to prove her loyalty to a man who now viewed her as his greatest traitor. They were trapped in a psychological prison of their own making, bound together by the necessity of defeating a common enemy, yet separated by a chasm of deception that threatened to swallow them whole. As the heavy silence reclaimed the executive office, the air remained thick with the suffocating reality of their new existence. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to lengthen, a chilling visual representation of the darkness that had finally consumed the Newman dynasty. Matt Clark remained out there, a silent, predatory force holding the ultimate leverage, entirely aware that his enemies were now bleeding from self-inflicted wounds. The ultimate, terrifying question hung in the stagnant air, echoing in the minds of the shattered family. When Matt Clark finally steps out of the shadows to deliver his killing blow against a family that no longer trusts each other, will there be anything left of the Newman Empire to save? Or will this profound betrayal be the exact weapon that finally reduces their legacy to ashes?